Wanted to do something a little different. In this video, I'll be giving my general thoughts and opinions on the mid-chapter 4.5.0 update for DBD. The major parts of the update were a small rework to Clown, a new UI, new survivor animations, and visual updates to the Meat Plant and Crotus Pren Asylum realms. Let's get right into it. This mid-chapter update gave us an entirely new HUD. A lot of people aren't super fond of it, but there's actually a lot I like about it.
Give me a moment to explain!
Okay, let me explain what I mean. I like the visual aspects of the new HUD. Having survivor portraits is awesome. I really like knowing which survivors are in my match, and it's especially useful to know who my obsession is if I have perks like Save the Best for Last. There's just something special about seeing a player named goated-__Jacob and having Bill's face next to that name. Another great update to the HUD is having a hook counter for killers and survivors. Behavior was pretty smart about this change and made sure that survivors can actually see how many times their teammates have been hooked, while killers just have an overall counter of 12 hooks. I really like the way they did this since it discourages tunneling, which I don't think is at all a bad thing. I like these new visual aspects of the HUD, but I really can't figure out why they moved the position of things. This is the main thing I don't like about the HUD. If the survivor portraits were moved to the bottom left like they were on the old HUD, I would actually quite like it. Likewise, the gen counter should have also stayed at the bottom left corner. The old HUD was so great because it had a ton of information all in one spot on the screen. Now the information is spread out in literally every corner of the screen, which just isn't very good design in my opinion. Survivor's movement animations have essentially been completely reworked from the ground up. A lot of these animations just look kind of off, for lack of a better word. I like the way survivors sneak around while walking, but just about every other animation looks weird. I really don't know how else to describe it. There are some cool parts of the new animations, such as your character actually crouching down when healing an injured teammate off the ground, or the fact that you can crouch while using a flashlight. One other weird thing that happens now is that your camera goes really low when you get knocked down. I guess this kind of makes sense, but yet again, it just feels kinda off. These new animations also change the overall movement and feel of playing Survivor. A lot of people say they really hate these changes, but for me personally, I don't feel much of a difference. Survivor movement feels about the same to me, but I do understand why people are complaining. Overall, this could be one of those things where we just need to give it some time to get used to it, but at the moment, I'm not a huge fan of most of the new animations. The Clown received a fairly big update in this patch. Alongside gaining a new aspect of his power, some of his add-ons were changed or reworked, and he also got a unique chase theme. The Clown now has a second bottle to throw alongside the pink gas, this one having yellow gas. Instead of slowing a survivor down, any player, both killer or survivor, that walks through the yellow gas will have their movement speed increased by 10% for 5 seconds. Clown also got a flat buff to his base bottle reload time, going down from 5 seconds to 3 seconds. I had pretty big expectations going into Clown's update, and I'm still not entirely sure how to feel about it. The update is still quite fresh at the time of making this video, so I'm sure that there's still some time to learn more about how to play the new Clown. With that being said, I'm fairly underwhelmed about Clown's update as a whole. The new gas feels really gimmicky to me. It seems like it could be quite strong in specific situations, but only in those really specific situations. It doesn't really help too much with Clown's map pressure, which was always one of his biggest issues. Using the new yellow gas to move around the map isn't super viable in my opinion, since it takes some time to set up and only gives you a small benefit to the actual distance you cover. This was probably one of the better clips I got using the new gas. If you can both slow a survivor with the purple gas while also boosting your own movement speed with the yellow gas, it can make a pretty deadly combo, but like I said previously, this only happens in really specific scenarios. The flat buff to his reload speed is super nice though. 3 seconds by default is great. It makes me feel like I'm not required to run a reload speed add-on anymore, which is always a plus in my book. Killers only have 2 add-on slots, so freeing one up is actually pretty crucial. Speaking of add-ons, the changes they did were overall pretty tame. Clown's new add-ons aren't anything super special, other than this monstrosity, but they did do some nice changes, such as removing his annoying exhaustion add-on. Overall, I would say I'm really lukewarm about Clown's update currently. I think it makes him more interesting to play as a killer, while also boosting his skill ceiling by a decent amount, but if you're a survivor, not too much has changed. It's still usually best to just pre-drop pallets against Clown, which makes for gameplay that just isn't very interesting. Clown is far from the most annoying killer to face, but I'd hoped that they would change up his power in a way that made him more interesting for both sides. As a whole, I would say this update to Clown definitely improves his strength, but not by a hugely significant amount. This patch included some updates to a few perks. You can now use Fixated while injured, which I think is an awesome change. I'm really surprised this wasn't a thing already. Second Wind now heals you faster after being unhooked. I also love this change. I already think Second Wind is somewhat underrated, and this change just makes it even better. Diversion charges up faster than it used to. Another simple but good change. For killer perks, Iron Maiden had its exposed duration increased to 30 seconds. This doesn't make Iron Maiden meta or anything, but you might actually have a chance to down an exposed survivor with its effect now. A solid change overall. The last perk that was changed is Hex Undying. We all knew this one was coming, and I'm really glad it did. Undying was an absolutely absurd perk before, being able to save one of your other totems from being cleansed multiple times a match. Ruin plus Undying was a crazy strong combo, and really annoying to face as a survivor, so I'm glad that Undying has been changed up a bit. Undying now only has aura reading if the survivor is near a dull totem instead of all totems, and it can now only transfer one of your other destroyed totems once per match. Undying actually did get buffed in a different way though. It now maintains tokens for hex perks like Devour Hope or Huntress's Lullaby. It might be a bit early to say it, but even after the changes, I still think Undying is pretty strong, and I could straight up see Undying plus Devour Hope become a new meta. Devour has always been a scary totem perk, and it now pairs almost perfectly with Undying. There were some minor adjustments to Wraith and Trapper in this update. Trapper now has a flat 1 out of 6 chance of escaping his bear traps on each attempt, but it now maxes out at 6 attempts. This is an alright change in my opinion. I think that slightly lessening the overall RNG of Trapper is a good thing. On average, this should make survivors stay in traps longer than they did before, while also preventing those frustrating scenarios as Survivor, where you literally take 10 plus attempts to get out. The Wraith is now completely invisible to survivors past 20 meters, while still being somewhat visible if he is closer to them like before. I really like this change. It's a perfect way to buff the Wraith's stealth without going too overboard. Wraith also got another great buff, that being an increase to his uncloaking speed boost. It now lasts 1.25 seconds instead of 1 second. This is actually a really large buff, and it's super noticeable in game. Wraith's speed boost after uncloaking was already quite strong, and this makes it even better. Overall, I'm really happy with the changes they did to Wraith. These are great buffs that help him out a lot. 2 realms were graphically updated, those being the Gideon Meat Plant and both Crotus Pren Asylum maps. I absolutely love the new look of the Meat Plant. It seems to contain a lot more references to the Saw movies, while also just looking much better visually. Oh, and there's rats.
Rats, we're rats, we're the rats. We pray at night, we stalk at night, we're the rats.
As far as gameplay goes, I'm not as much a fan of the new Meat Plant. The old version of the map already had a huge amount of god palettes, and this update only added even more. Seriously, some of these new palettes are actually ridiculous. They literally wall off entire sections of the map and basically create choke points that you have to get through at some point. Speaking of walls, there were a bunch of breakable walls added to this map. Like most maps that they are on, these breakable walls kind of just act like roadblocks that you have to get around. Kicking them can be a hassle, and doing so doesn't even really benefit you that much on this map compared to other ones. The positions of these walls can also create annoying dead ends that can cause frustrating situations for both killers and survivors. One good change they did to the Meat Plant was making the top floor much more open overall. The limited sight was always an annoying part of indoor maps, so this change actually does a really great job at fixing that issue. Overall, I don't like the addition of more god palettes to the Meat Plant, but I do really like the new visual aesthetics, and I also quite like the openness of the top floor now. Both Crotus Pren Asylum maps look awesome now. I always thought something was off about the original versions of the maps, and this graphic update finally fixes that problem. What did it fix? Well, the original versions of both Asylum maps were supposed to be burned down structures. The new versions of these maps do a much better job at conveying this. Trees are present, but completely barren of any leaves, while the main building of both maps are charred. Various burned down huts also make up a large amount of the new tiles of the maps. Breakable walls were added to the main buildings of both maps, but they aren't extremely annoying. Father Campbell's Chapel in particular was already one of the best maps in the game for its gameplay, which this graphic update thankfully doesn't get rid of. The main building on Disturbed Ward is still pretty strong, but it's definitely not the worst thing ever. Overall, I'm really happy with the visual updates to both Asylum maps. The spirit of the original maps is still there, while both look much better visually. Hitboxes right now are hilariously bad for survivors. Or, I guess I really shouldn't say hitboxes, but more so this absurd desync that's going on. Killers can hit you from really far away. Most people think that this is caused by some kind of server desync, since the hits look fine from the killer's perspective. This happened even before this patch, but it usually only occurred if the killer had bad ping. Now it seems to happen all the time regardless of ping, so playing Survivor is pretty frustrating right now. You can turn your killer wall in the pregame lobby though, so that's a plus. I really hope this isn't a bug, but it's definitely a bug. One other nice thing that came out of this patch is skill checks. They feel way smoother now. I don't really know how else to describe it, but they just feel better, if that makes sense. As a whole, I would say this patch has some pretty controversial changes. I wouldn't call it the absolute worst patch ever, but it does contain a lot of changes that just flat out are not good for the game. The animations feel janky, the new UI is cluttered and confusing, and the Clown's update was relatively small overall. I do think that the visual updates to the maps they changed were great, and the perk changes this update were quite solid. The main things I would like to see in future patches are some changes to the HUD, and maybe a bit of polish on some of the new Survivor animations. Oh, and please fix whatever this is. I'll see you next time.